Good afternoon. I hope you've had a good week and are looking forward to the Labor Day weekend. I'll remind you that we do not have class on Monday, either virtual or in person. Our next class, or rather our next in-person class, will be on Wednesday, and of course on Wednesday there will also be an online lecture for the Monday group. And furthermore, I would remind you that you do have a paper due by the end of the day on Wednesday on the Epic of Gilgamesh. Remember, you are reading and finishing the Epic of Gilgamesh for Wednesday, and then writing the one-page single-space paper, the prompt of which is found on As You Learn. So be sure to do that. If you have questions about it, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. Remember that I'm not only happy to answer questions via email, I'm also happy to set up a Zoom meeting with you if you would find that useful. So today what I'd like to do is talk a little bit more about Sumerian society. And remember that part of what I'm trying to do here is to paint for you, as it were, a picture of Sumerian society at a fairly early stage, so that you can think about it as part of the broader picture of which the Epic of Gilgamesh is a sort of fragment. Remember, consistent with the idea of the hermeneutic circle, we always need to think about the part in terms of the whole, and then the whole in terms of the part. So, in a sense, if Gilgamesh is the part, if Gilgamesh is one very specific, however important it is, product of ancient Sumerian society, the question is, what else can we know about Sumerian society? What else can we know about the way this early civilization lived that can help shed light on the meaning of this cultural work that we are examining and that you are reading? Remember that I, earlier this week, introduced the idea that of the Neolithic Revolution, the moment in human cultural development when farming and animal domestication were invented and became a regular feature of human society. And I described the Sumerians as an example of society that had gone through the Neolithic Revolution. I also made the case that that they were an early example of civilization, and tried to suggest that that term has some very concrete meaning. It's a way of referring to a particular type of society. And I argued that a key element, or a key sort of condition of a civilization, is the existence of an agricultural surplus, and I tried to sort of tease out what some features of that are. We talked about that earlier this week. Some features of an agricultural surplus, some things that become consequences or possibilities because of an agricultural surplus, include a complex social structure, the development of religion, especially in the sense of a kind of religion as an organized social institution, and the development of kingship, and particularly what we call the state, understood as a particular institution in society that is charged with leadership and government. The fourth consequence, which I'd really like to get going with today, and that is one that I haven't referred to yet, but that is extremely important not only for understanding Sumerians, but also for this course, which is focused on the history of culture, is one that might seem at first glance kind of surprising. And that is, quite simply, the invention of writing. Now, you might not completely agree with me as describing this as a consequence of an agricultural surplus. And I suppose I would concede that this is not necessarily one of those directly caused type of consequences. This is not a sort of billiard ball-like consequence where one thing immediately leads to the other, but I do think that there is a very close connection between farming and agricultural surplus and the development of writing. And I think that the Sumerians in particular, among early civilizations that developed writing, make this particularly clear. So let me explain. The evidence that we have of Sumerian society, from Sumerian society, and from archaeological research that has been done in Mesopotamia relating to the Sumerians, is that the earliest forms of writing, and particularly what later evolved into writing in Sumeria, were record keeping, and specifically record keeping designed to keep track of stockpiles of farmed goods. So quite literally, you could say the first purpose of writing was to keep track of farm surpluses. If you had an excess of barley that you wished to store, say in a ziggurat of the kind that I described earlier this week, you needed records, and if you needed records, you needed a symbolic system to record what you wish to say about those particular stockpiles, possibly their date, possibly their quantity, possibly their ownership, possibly taxes that might be owed on them, and this takes the form of early writing. The first form of writing that we see in the case of the Sumerians is known as cuneiform. Okay, cuneiform is not a Sumerian word. It is a word that is used, that is applied to them, that refers to wedge-shaped writing. And I'll show you some further examples of this, but I think that the picture that I show you right here on this slide gives you an example of what I am talking about. This is an example of cuneiform writing. If you want to sort of just a kind of intuitive sense of what cuneiform looks like, it looks like this. So let's talk about sort of the material nature of this writing first. Remember that I've described on several occasions that Mesopotamia, while it does have water thanks to the Tigris and the Euphrates and the various forms of irrigation connected to them, it is lacking in many other resources such as stone and wood. But one thing it has a lot of is mud and clay. So here's the basic way in which you do record keeping in Mesopotamia. You go to the banks of the Tigris, you dip down and you sort of pull out from the shore a nice big moist wad of clay. Then right nearby it, you snap a reed, and there are many reeds. The plant called the reed located along the shore. And then if you kind of snap the reed in two, as the picture shows, you can get a sharp edge. And then what you start to do is you start to puncture the wad of clay that you have. And there's sort of two main things that you can do. You can either use the sharp edge to draw lines, or you can sort of push the whole sort of end of the reed into the clay, so that it makes these kind of triangle shapes, which are the wedges in question. So through a kind of combination of wedges and lines, you can come up with a symbolic system that is a form of writing. So, and then what you do to preserve it is you leave it in the hot Mesopotamian sun, and it bakes, and you have a more or less permanent record. Incidentally, it's interesting that this is kind of roughly the same process they use to make bricks as well. I'm sure I'm leaving out some technical details, but it's roughly the same idea. So let's take a look at what these actually look like. And again, sort of, you'll have to sort of pardon my enthusiasm for this, but what I think is sort of kind of powerful, possibly even a bit mind-blowing about this is the very idea that just like with Lascaux cave paintings, we are seeing products of very, very ancient mines. We are seeing something similar with these cuneiform tablets. We are seeing records that were intentionally made by ancient Sumerians some 4,000 or 5,000 or more years ago. Let's take a look at them. So this is an example of what these early forms of writing look like. Again, you'll have to forgive my enthusiasm once more, find them to be sort of rather beautiful, but you don't have to agree with me. And I'd also just call attention to the fact that many of these, if you actually see them in person, there are certain museums that have vast collections of these because there are abundant quantities of these that were produced and that have lasted. You'll see that they're actually often quite small. The actual tablet that we're looking here would probably just be an inch or two in either way. And what did they write? What did they say when this kind of remarkable invention of writing was first concocted? Wonderful thing about the Sumerians is that they are a very sort of practical people. And so these first forms of record keeping are very, very closely tied to the business of ordinary life. What this particular picture is of, because again, we have actually decoded cuneiform, so meaning that we can read the language that is expressed in it, is a contract. It's a contract involving the sale of a field. It's a business arrangement between a buyer and a seller. It would be like as if someone many millennia from now found some little distant trace of our own culture and were intrigued with what sort of ideas we had to say, and in fact what they had stumbled upon was a lease between you and the company that owns your apartment. That's sort of what we're seeing right here. I am particularly fond of this one, or I find this to be, I guess I should say, a kind of interesting artifact and an interesting insight into the society. Another sort of material feature of Sumerian society, because one of their main crops was barley, was the production of beer. They are beer producers and beer drinkers, and they believe their gods are as well. I think I mentioned that. And what you have right here is a record of an offering made to a Sumerian god, probably at a ziggurat, of beer. I could, say that it's almost kind of like finding not a lease with your landlord, but like finding the tab for your beer consumption at a local bar. That's not totally true because, of course, it's about offerings to a god, but it is something along those lines. And this one is from 2000 BCE, meaning about 4,000 years old. And again, you can see the writing that consists of this kind of combination of wedges and lines. So what I'd like to start talking about just for a moment is what exactly writing is. Again, that you know what writing is. You have been practicing it yourself for some time in various technical forms. But I'd like us to think about it somewhat mindfully, again, from sort of the perspective of the development of culture. And just to state an obvious fact, if we can read something like the Epic of Gilgamesh, if I can ask you to write a paper about the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's because this is a work of literature that was actually written down, and the records of which were preserved and are known to us. So the issue of writing is not only an important feature of Sumerian society, but it's also one of the conditions for us knowing about that society as well. And to connect back to Lascaux, I suppose the question that I would ask is, what is the difference between art, i.e. drawing or painting, and writing? They are both intentional human expressions that are recorded or preserved through material means. So there's a considerable similarity between them. How are they similar? How are they different? Well, this turns out to be an important issue because one of the things that we see in the history of Sumerian writing, in the evolution of Sumerian writing, is that the first form of writing is picture writing. And this is, we'll see, is actually common to the development of writing in other societies as well, whether it be ancient China or the ancient Egyptians, just to sort of name a few. Let me just sort of say a word or two about them. What I'm going to talk about is sort of the story of how writing develops by referencing the Sumerians as an example, and just point out that it consists of several different stages. The first stage in the development of writing is called pictographic writing, and it is very straightforward. And I'm sure that, you know, as maybe children or playing games, you've had an experience with this. It's actually, I would say, something that might be kind of quite recent to you, because I would suggest that there's sort of been a return to pictographic writing, very interestingly, in our digital culture through emojis. If you think about emojis, emojis are pictographs. I mean, that's not a stretch. That's almost literally the case. So if you want to think about the pros and cons of pictographic writing, think about the pros and cons of trying to have a conversation with someone via text message through emojis. It can be fun, it can be useful, you can actually communicate quite a lot, but there's obviously limitations. So the basic concept of pictographic writing is that each sign represents an object. So just to be clear, every single thing that you write represents a particular thing, okay? If you look at this early pictographic tablet, and you'll see that the date on this is considerably more ancient than some of the other ones that I was just showing to you, because it's this early stage. This is from about 5,000 BC, 5,000 years ago. You'll see, for example, a hand, or you'll see, for example, in the upper left-hand corner, or you'll see in the lower right something that looks kind of like a pitchfork, and many pictures that represent various kinds of plants. Each object represents the particular thing. The sort of symbolic system of pictographic writing is symbol represents thing. Okay, and so it's closely connected to actual painting. But there are some problems that result from it. First of all, it leads to an excessive number of signs. Why? An excessive number of symbols. Why? Because literally everything needs a symbol to represent it. Okay? Different kinds of trees are going to need symbols that are unique to them to convey who they are. Each particular thing in the world needs its own symbol. It also is difficult to represent ideas. This is interesting from an emoji perspective, because I think often the purpose of emojis, as the name suggests, is to represent things that are not completely concrete, right? Emojis typically represent feelings or emotions. So we do have, we have a kind of maybe rich sense right now of what the different kinds of emotions are. So consequently, we have a vast array of emojis. But I would just sort of suggest that there's an inherent kind of trickiness there, because it can be challenging to represent something non-physical through a symbol. For example, how do you represent something? It's one thing to represent something like bird or sun. It's a more difficult thing to represent something like power, oppression. How do you represent those things as signs? I'm not saying you can't do it, it's just more challenging. There's also the basic problem of ambiguity, which I suspect is a big issue in emojis as well, to keep coming back to that example. In other words, somebody's understanding of a symbol might be different from another person's understanding of the symbol. So there's that, and there's also the problem that pictograms cannot typically represent parts of speech. How do you distinguish a hand understood as an actual hand, my physical hand, versus the idea of to hand over something? In one case it's an actual object, in the other case it's an action, i.e., to use a grammatical term, a verb. So these are problems in pictographic writing. And we'll see that some of these problems get addressed at the next stage. So, as you may have noticed, I actually had to briefly disconnect, so I am back, and I'd like to now turn to considering the second stage of writing that sort of is an attempt to address some of the problems that pictographic writing was unable to overcome. The next stage of writing is known as ideographic writing. And I would say that, strictly speaking, ideographic writing is less a stage in itself than kind of the latter phase of pictographic writing. It's kind of a moment in the history of pictographic writing rather than a genuine stage in itself. And the essence of ideographic writing is the following. You're still dealing with symbols that are basically pictures, although it's interesting that the pictures become increasingly abstract and stylized. There's no longer as much attention on making the picture look like the actual thing, and more of a kind of emphasis on making it a simple and immediately recognizable symbol. Sort of like no one on a cell phone is really trying to make a smiley face look like an actual human face. They're just trying to make it look like a recognizable emoji, as it were, in all of its simplicity. So on the one hand, you have symbols that are still representing things, however simplified and stylized. On the other hand, what's being represented by these things, these symbols representing things, are no longer just the things themselves, but increasingly abstract and less concrete ideas. So you obviously still need symbols to represent physical things. You need a symbol to represent, a horse, or a symbol to represent irrigation system or something like that. But you also start to expand your ability to refer to any number of parts of speech or vocabulary terms that are not just concrete anymore. So take, for example, this picture that I show here in my slide, which again is sort of drawn directly from the Sumerian experience. On the one hand, you have in the far left you have a head. Okay, now you can see by this point the picture for a head has become increasingly sort of simplified and stylized. As I said, you probably can tell sort of very roughly that the sort of bottom part of that symbol there on the far left is meant to be the back of the head. The top part of it is kind of a combination of sort of the nose and an open mouth. Maybe to the left you can see something that's kind of meant to represent an eye. So it's still sort of like a head, but increasingly simplified. Then there's the question of, well, what if you don't want to represent the head, but just a part of the head? You might choose to represent, in short, the mouth. How do you do that? Well, one way to do that is to kind of have this shading, the picture calls it stippling, that indicates what part of the head that you're talking about. Okay, so that becomes the symbol for the mouth. And then you might want to sort of indicate something that is done with the mouth, such as eating. So you have the third picture, which shows, the pictograph for mouth with something kind of like a Sumerian pizza slice going into it. That is meant to sort of represent, except in fact it's of course bread, which is meant to represent eating. Okay, so the picture shows something concrete, a particular piece of bread going into a particular mouth, but it's meant to suggest something vaguer and more abstract, i.e., the action, the verb form, if you will, of eating. There are other ways that this sort of shift to ideographs works, such as having a part stand for the whole. What I mean by that is you might represent an ear of corn, not just to refer to a particular ear of corn, but as a way of sort of referring to the broader activity of farming. Okay, so in short, what you have is this kind of transition within the pictographic form of writing from simply representing concrete images to representing less concrete things that one might wish to express through language. And which, of course, by the way, it's important to remember, can already be expressed presumably through spoken language, but can't be expressed by this point through written language. That's the sort of issue. That's the disconnect, if you will. The final stage is one that you know, and that represents a major shift in the way writing works. And when I say that you know it, I mean that literally, because it is the form of writing that you have learned and that you spent a number of years in your childhood and more recently perhaps mastering, namely what's called either phonetic or alphabetic writing. The key shift here involves what exactly the written symbols are representing. With pictographic writing, the goal was to represent actual things that exist in reality or in nature. With what's called phonetic writing, you renounce that goal. You give up that goal. Your goal is no longer to have pictures that actually represent things that exist in the world. Your goal is now to represent the sounds that the human mouth makes when it utters words. Okay, that's what phonetic writing means. Phonetic comes from the word for sound or for speech. And so the symbols become an alphabet, and what an alphabet means, strictly speaking, is not just symbols that represent things, but symbols that represent the range of possible sounds that the human mouth makes when it speaks, and specifically when it speaks a particular language. In terms of sort of how this sort of process works and how it evolves over time, I would just say that that it's important to understand that we no longer have pictographs, or what scholars call pictographs, in the cuneiform language as it writing system as it develops. But we have what are called phonemes, okay? And a phoneme is, like a pictograph, a symbol, but it's a symbol that represents a sound, okay? So if you look at the Sumerian alphabet, and the Sumerians do in fact have an alphabet, at least at a certain point in their development, you can see what I'm talking about. The phonemes represent particular sounds. So the one in the upper left-hand corner represents ah or a. The one in the lower right-hand corner represents h or ha. So there's a range of different possible sounds that can be represented by different symbols. And of course, this is very, very similar to the kind of alphabet that we have. Another sort of interesting so let me before I say the point that I was going to make, let me just sort of go to the next slide to sort of see how this evolves. Okay, this slide or this picture shows the evolution of Sumerian writing as it relates to several specific signs or words. And you'll see that there's certain things that happen corresponding to different, roughly the sort of different dates. There's a point at which you have the sort of pure pictographic system. There's a point when, for various reasons, people decide that you have to kind of tilt it horizontally. And then what really starts to happen is there's this kind of shift towards an increasing what I would call sort of stylization of the symbols, so that the goal is, maybe this is kind of the emoji stage, if you will. The goal is no longer just to show the picture, but to show a kind of quick and efficient way of representing the picture. This you see at the sort of 2400 BCE moment. And then you have the final moment when it becomes sort of almost kind of completely abstracted, to the point that even though scholars believe that these symbols at the 1000 BCE level can still be traced back to the one 2000 years before, one no longer sees the image in the symbol by this point. But what has happened by the time we get to 1000 BCE is that the symbols are no longer representing the actual thing. They are simply representing the sound. The way this often works is that particular symbols began to be used not to sort of represent the thing, but to represent the sound of the thing. So, for example, to start with the first one, head. Now, and apparently the Sumerian word for that is sag. At a certain point, the symbol is no longer being used to represent an actual head, but the sound head. So, for example, I might use the symbol for head as a way to construct the word hedonistic in English. Now, head and hedonism have nothing in common, but the sound. So I still might use them to the symbol to construct that word, but I am completely dismissing at this point any reference to the object and am simply using the symbol to refer to the sound. And once that transition has been made, one then sees the development of what I'm calling alphabetic writing, i.e. writing that is phonetic, that consists of a breakdown of sounds. One thing I'd just like you to think about for a moment is, what are the pros and cons of alphabetic writing? What sort of advantages come with alphabetic writing? Think about that for a moment, even just to yourself. See if you can try and answer that question. Well, there's any number of things that you might come up with. I would just sort of mention a few that perhaps you contemplated. The first one might be that there's simply the opportunity to write about more, to say more. In pictographic writing, you always need to have a kind of agreement on what the symbol means and what thing it's going to refer to before you can even pretend to understand it. As we know, and as you know from your own experience learning to read, at a certain point you can learn new words by sounding them out, by being able to decode the word's meaning simply because you know how you know the sounds that the word that the symbols that constitute the word refer to. So if you see CAT, you understand that means that you can sort of spell out cat. The same would have been true of Little Sumerians. So there's a whole sort of range of different meanings of words and their meanings that one can have access to that one cannot have access to with pictographic writing, because that implies this kind of prior understanding of what the symbol means. I would also say that it's a lot less taxing on the memory. Okay, the problem with pictographic writing is that it means that you literally need a different symbol for everything. Even if some symbols get partially kind of just reused or modified, you still need to know what those mean. So you're dealing with a system that has, potentially a limitless number of symbols, or at least easily several thousand. When you're talking about alphabetic writing, you're looking at a much more limited number of sounds, which does mean that you can actually imagine something kind of like mass literacy, whereas a system that depends on the ability of a few human minds to master a large number of symbols is necessarily going to have a sort of more kind of specialized and thus exclusive character. Another sort of final point that I think is very interesting is the notion that a same set of alphabetic symbols can refer to different languages. Okay, if you didn't know, if you were brought up writing Arabic and you weren't familiar with the Roman-based system of the Roman-based alphabet that we use, just from seeing these words that you have on my slide, you wouldn't know that the language was English. Okay, those same letters could be French, could be Spanish, could be Finnish, you name it. Yes, of course, it's true that those languages actually have sort of accents and whatnot that are not found in English, so those could be good indicators. But the fact remains that that a same set of phonetic symbols can be used by different languages. And the same is true with cuneiform. Cuneiform is invented by the Sumerians, but other peoples who will inhabit Mesopotamia will adopt it and use it for their own languages. So sometimes there's always a question when we see cuneiform of what language it is. It could be Sumerian, but it could also be Akkadian, Babylonian, or some of these other people who eventually inhabit Mesopotamia. So that is where I think I'm going to end for today. Where I will be going on next week is a few final thoughts about Sumerian religion and culture. We do move through these societies pretty quickly, but remember, your goal for Wednesday is as follows. First of all, I'm going to give you a short discussion assignment related to this lecture. Second of all, I'm going to ask that you finish, as I announced earlier this week, the Epic of Gilgamesh for Wednesday. And then finally, you will have the short paper that is also due by the end of the day, Wednesday, the prompt of which is on As You Learn. Thank you very much. I hope you have a great Labor Day weekend, and I look forward to seeing some of you next week. The Wednesday group on Wednesday, the others via an online lecture, and of course, for Friday of next week, like I did today, there will be a Zoom session for those interested, and a lecture. I will see you all next week. Take care.